Howdy and welcome to Roughly. Today's story is called The Comfortable Cage. If you like to keep a pen or a piece of paper nearby, you might find something worth holding on to. Now settle in. It begins like this. The ticket sat in Tom Walker's hand. Santa Fe. A train waited at the station. Steam drifted into the morning air. Passengers climbed aboard while conductors called final instructions. Thomas stared at the ticket. For a moment, he imagined himself stepping onto the train, leaving, going somewhere unfamiliar, starting something different. Then he folded the ticket, tore it in half, and dropped the pieces into a trash barrel. When the train pulled away, Thomas remained on the platform, watching, as he had done for nearly 20 years. Nobody in town would have called Thomas unhappy. He was the railroad dispatcher, respected, reliable, well paid. His house was larger than most. His clothes were always clean. His future was secure. But every morning felt exactly like the one before. The same station, the same schedules, the same trains, the same clock on the wall. And somehow each year felt shorter than the last. 3 days later, Thomas rode out to Frank's farm. He found Frank repairing a section of fence beside the pasture. A hammer hung from the one hand. A bucket of nails rested nearby. Frank nodded as Thomas approached. Morning, morning. Frank returned to his work. The silence lasted nearly a minute. Thomas finally spoke. I should be grateful. Frank drove another nail into the post. Maybe. I have a good job. Another nail. Maybe. Thomas frowned. Most people talked more than this. Frank never seemed interested in filling silence. Thomas glanced toward the pasture. 2 horses stood near the far fence. One was young and restless. The other one was an old workhorse with a gray around its muzzle. The younger horse wandered everywhere. The old one walked the same narrow path over and over and over, back and forth, the same route, as if we could not imagine another. Thomas watched for a while. Old horse, Frank nodded. Been walking the trail for years. The horse reached the end of the path, turned around, walked back again. Frank tapped another post into place. Then he said, funny thing about horses. Thomas waited. After enough years, some stopped testing the fence. That was all. Frank picked up another board. The conversation seemed finished. Thomas thought about the horse during the ride home, and the next day, and the day after that. 2 months later, the railroad company assigned a new assistant dispatcher to the station. His name was Samuel Reed, 42, experienced, capable. He had worked on other rail lines before arriving in town. Thomas expected to spend months of correcting mistakes. Instead, Samuel learned everything quickly. Within weeks, he handed responsibilities Thomas had carried alone for many, many years. And for the first time in a long life, Thomas had free time. At first, he didn't know what to do with it. One Saturday evening, Samuel insisted Thomas leaving before sunset. I've got it. Thomas hesitated. You sure? Samuel laughed. The trains aren't going to run away. Thomas smiled. Then he headed into town. A summer festival filled the main street. Lanterns hung from wooden poles. Children ran between vendors. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the warm evening air. Music spilled from the saloon. Thomas nearly walked past. Then he heard laughter, real laughter, not the polite kind people exchanged at work, the kind that came from people enjoying themselves. Before he realized it, he stepped inside. The place was packed. A piano player hammered away in the corner. A fiddle joined the melody. Boots stomped on the floor, across the whole floor. People clapped along. Thomas stood near the back, watching. An old ranger spotted him. "Thomas Walker!" Thomas returned. The ranger laughed. "Haven't seen you in years." Thomas smiled awkwardly. "Oh, been busy. Ain't we all?" The music grew faster. Someone pulled Thomas toward the dance floor. At first, he hesitated, half-heartedly. Then he finally gave in. His line dancing was messy. He missed steps, stepped on someone's foot, nearly lost his balance twice. Everyone laughed, including him, especially him, for the first time in many years. Later, a group of women stepped onto a small stage. Their voices filled the room. People applauded after every song. Thomas found himself applauding too, smiling, dancing, listening. The evening passed quickly, too quickly. When Thomas finally walked home beneath the stars, he felt lighter than he had in many, many years. The festival remained alive behind him. Music drifted through the darkness. Voices echoed down the street. The town felt alive. Then he reached his porch, sat down, and the realization arrived, quietly, like a knife. The festival wasn't new. The music wasn't new. The people weren't new. And the laughter wasn't new. All of it had existed for many years, while he sat at the train station, while he worked late, while he convinced himself there was no other way. Thomas stared toward the distant glow of town. A knot tightened in his chest, not because he hated his job, because he suddenly understood something worse. He had missed years of his own life. Years gone, never returning. The following week, he rode to Frank's farm. Frank was repairing a gate, as usual. Thomas leaned against the fence. For a while, neither man spoke. Finally, Thomas said, I could have done this years ago. Frank continued working. Thomas shook his head. I kept telling myself I didn't have a choice. Frank looked toward the pasture. The old horse still walked its familiar path, back and forth, back and forth. Frank watched it for a moment, then said, "Most cages aren't built to hurt the animal." Thomas looked at him. Frank returned to the gate. That's why they work. The words followed Thomas home. Months passed. Samuel continued proving himself. The railroad expanded. Traffic increased. More workers arrived. The station no longer depended entirely on Thomas. And slowly, a possibility emerged. One Thomas would never have considered before. A year earlier, Thomas would have thought he has to keep and fight and fought to keep every responsibility, every title, every ounce of authority. Now he found himself thinking differently. One morning he sat across from a railroad supervisor. The man expected a request for promotion. Instead, Thomas proposed something unusual: shared responsibilities, reduced hours, Samuel taking a larger role, Thomas remaining involved, but no longer carrying everything himself. The supervisor stared at him. "You worked 20 years to get here." Thomas nodded. Maybe." The supervisor waited. Thomas smiled. "But I don't want to spend 20 more standing in the same room." The arrangement took time, but eventually it happened. His income dropped a little. His prestige dropped too. Some people thought he was crazy. Others thought he lacked ambition. One man called him ungrateful. Thomas stopped trying to explain. Instead, he spent his 3 days building something of his own. Small repair work, woodworking, helping rangers with projects around town. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic, just work that belonged to him. One autumn morning, Thomas walked through town carrying a bundle of tools. A train rolled into the station. Steam filled the air. Passengers stepped onto the platform. Conductors shouted instructions. Everything looked exactly as it always had, but something was different. Thomas wasn't hurrying toward it. He wasn't trapped inside it. The railroad remained part of his life. It simply wasn't all of his life anymore. He stopped for a moment, looked toward the station, then smiled. A small smile, a kind nobody else notices, a kind that matters most. And for the first time in many years, Thomas felt something he could not remember feeling: relief. Some people stay because they are trapped. Others stay because they're comfortable. The second prison is harder to leave. What are your thoughts on these stories? Leave them in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories from Frank, step a little closer to the fire. Like, share and subscribe.